Ethan Walker hadn't felt his heart break open in years, not since the night he came home from war to an empty house and a silence that never left. But when the flames on Maple Street parted just long enough for him to hear a newborn's desperate cry and a tiny soot-covered hand curled around his finger as a faint voice seemed to whisper, "Mama," the former Navy SEAL dropped to his knees in the rain and wept like a man who had just found his soul again. If you want to know how this baby rescued from the fire changed a broken warrior's life forever, subscribe to our channel and stay until the end. Comment your city below so we can see how far this story of hope and miracles travels. Cold rain pressed low over Portland's Maple Street, the kind that blurred streetlights into trembling halos and made the night feel smaller, tighter, as if the city itself were holding its breath. Ethan Walker moved at an unhurried pace along the sidewalk, boots steady, posture upright in a way that never truly left him. At 36, he carried the lean strength of a man shaped by discipline rather than vanity. Broad shoulders tapering into a controlled frame, movements economical, precise. His face was angular, cut with sharp cheekbones, and a jaw that looked as though it had learned to set itself against bad news. A short beard traced that jaw, dark with flecks of gray that arrived earlier than expected, souvenirs from years that refused to stay buried. His hair was kept close to his scalp, regulation short even now, though no one required it anymore. People who met him often described him as calm, distant but not cold, polite, quiet, a man who listened more than he spoke. What they could not see was the way silence pressed louder on him since the night 8 years ago, when a phone call from overseas told him his newborn son had lived for only 3 hours. That loss had burned a hollow into Ethan that neither medals nor discharge papers could fill. Beside him walked Rex, a 4-year-old German shepherd with a powerful chest and a thick sable coat darkened along the spine like a permanent shadow. Rex's ears stood tall, alert, even during routine walks, and his amber eyes tracked everything: the drip of rain from awnings, the distant echo of traffic, the subtle shifts of scent carried on the damp air. Trained during Ethan's final deployment, Rex was disciplined without being rigid, loyal without needing command. Around strangers he was reserved, around Ethan he was wordless understanding on 4 legs. Since returning to civilian life, Rex had become both anchor and compass, the one presence that kept Ethan moving forward on nights when memories tried to pull him backward. They were halfway down Maple Street when the sound came. Not the roar of fire, not yet, but a brittle crack, sharp as a snapped bone. Ethan stopped instantly. Rex froze at the same moment, body lowering, muscles coiling. A second later, orange light flared 2 houses down, reflected in the wet pavement. Flames pushed through the upper windows of an aging 2-story house, the kind with peeling white paint and sagging porch rails, once charming, now tired. Smoke rolled thick and black, swallowing the rain as if it were nothing. Neighbors spilled into the street in fragments. A tall, thin man in a flannel shirt pulling on boots without socks. A middle-aged woman with blonde hair hastily knotted at her neck, clutching a phone to her chest. A teenage boy standing barefoot on the curb, eyes wide and useless with shock. Someone screamed that the fire department had been called. Someone else shouted that the house was empty. Ethan didn't answer either claim. He was already moving closer, eyes narrowing, calculating angles and time the way he used to measure doorways and blast radii. Rex growled low, not in fear but recognition. He pulled slightly on the leash, nose lifted, drawing in smoke-laced air. Then he barked once, short, sharp, deliberate. Ethan felt it before he understood it. That tightening in his chest, that old familiar certainty that something had been missed. He closed his eyes for half a breath and listened, past the chaos. Beneath the roar of fire, beneath the rain and shouting, there it was, a sound so thin it barely existed, a broken, reedy cry struggling against smoke. A baby. Ethan's mind didn't debate. It never did in moments like this. He shrugged out of his jacket, soaked it at a nearby puddle, wrapped it around his mouth and nose, then loosened Rex's leash. "Find," he said quietly. Rex surged forward without hesitation, paws skidding on wet steps as they reached the front door, which hung open, coughing smoke like a living thing. Heat struck Ethan's face immediately, fierce and unforgiving. Inside, the house groaned, beams popping under stress. They moved low. Rex led with instinct sharpened by training, weaving through debris, avoiding collapsing furniture. Smoke burned Ethan's lungs, each breath a fight. In a small back bedroom partially shielded by a fallen dresser, Rex stopped and lay down, positioning his body between the flames, licking through the hallway and a bundled shape on the floor. A baby girl? Impossibly small, wrapped in a thin blanket, her cries weak and uneven. Her skin was flushed, lips trembling, eyes squeezed shut against a world that had turned violent too soon. Ethan scooped her up, cradling her against his chest, feeling the frantic flutter of her heartbeat. For a moment, a dangerous human moment, his mind betrayed him, overlaying the weight in his arms with a memory of another child he had never held. The house shuddered violently, snapping him back. Rex pressed close, guarding. As Ethan turned and ran, they burst through the doorway just as the upper floor collapsed inward, fire roaring its anger into the rain-soaked night. On the sidewalk, strangers stared in stunned silence. Sirens wailed in the distance at last. Ethan dropped to one knee, shielding the baby from the cold, Rex standing over them both like a living wall. The infant coughed, then cried louder, stronger, clinging to life with a stubbornness that cut through Ethan deeper than the smoke ever could. He didn't know her name. He didn't know where she came from. But as her tiny fingers curled around his thumb, one truth settled into him with quiet force. This night was not finished with him yet. Dawn arrived pale and exhausted, as if the city itself had not slept after the fire, and the smell of smoke still clung to Maple Street when Ethan Walker stood outside St. Vincent Hospital with Rex at his heel, rain finally giving way to a thin gray mist. Inside, the newborn girl was alive, breathing steadily now, but that knowledge had not loosened the tight knot in Ethan's chest. He sat rigid on a plastic chair in the emergency corridor, elbows on knees, hands clasped together as if holding something invisible. His face looked harder in the hospital light, the sharp angles more pronounced, the faint scar near his right eyebrow, earned years ago from flying debris during a night operation, standing out like punctuation on a sentence he had never finished writing. Rex lay beside him, chin on his paws, eyes half-lidded yet alert, his ears flicking at every passing footstep, refusing to fully rest while Ethan was still unsettled. A nurse named Emily Carter emerged from the trauma bay and approached them. She was in her early 30s, tall and athletic in the quiet, unglamorous way of someone accustomed to long shifts on her feet. Her auburn hair was pulled into a loose bun that had begun to slip, strands escaping to frame a freckled face marked by calm competence. Her eyes were a steady green, the kind that didn't flinch easily, even after bad nights. "She's stable," Emily said, voice gentle but firm, as if she understood how fragile words could be in moments like this. "Mild smoke inhalation, elevated heart rate, but she's strong. You did the right thing bringing her in when you did." Ethan nodded once, a restrained motion that carried more gratitude than he could speak. Rex lifted his head slightly, tail tapping the floor once, sensing the shift in air. Behind Emily stood a man who hadn't been there before, introduced moments later as Detective Mark Reynolds from Portland Police. Reynolds was in his mid-40s, broad through the shoulders, with a build softened by years behind a desk rather than on the street. His hair was dark but thinning at the crown, and a neatly trimmed mustache gave him an old-fashioned seriousness. His eyes, however, were sharp, observant, shaped by too many nights cataloging other people's worst decisions. "Mr. Walker," Reynolds said, extending a hand, "I need to ask you a few questions about the fire." His tone was respectful, but there was a weight behind it, the practiced neutrality of someone trained to keep emotions boxed away. Ethan shook his hand, grip firm but controlled, answering with concise clarity. He described the sound, the light, the cry, never embellishing, never dramatizing. Reynolds listened carefully, occasionally jotting notes, his brow furrowing when Ethan mentioned that the baby had been alone. As the morning stretched on, the fire's story began to unravel. Reynolds explained that the house belonged to a man named Lucas Bennett, a name that carried no warmth, even when spoken neutrally. Bennett, according to preliminary records, was a white male in his late 30s, with a history of financial trouble, and a recent insurance policy taken out on the property. He had been arrested overnight after being found a few blocks away, smelling of gasoline and panic. The baby, however, was a complication no one had anticipated. No birth records, no immediate relatives reporting a missing child. Ethan felt something twist inside him at that. Absence could be louder than screams. Later that morning, a woman arrived at the hospital claiming distant kinship. Her name was Margaret Collins, and she carried herself with an air that tried too hard to be composed. She was in her early 50s, slim, with straight blonde hair cut precisely at the shoulders and pale skin stretched tight over sharp cheekbones. Her clothes were expensive but understated, chosen to signal respectability rather than warmth. Her smile didn't quite reach her eyes, which darted too often toward the nurse's station. She spoke softly, hands folded, voice trembling in a way that felt rehearsed. Emily noticed it immediately. So did Rex, who rose to his feet and placed himself squarely between Ethan and the woman. Body stiff, a low warning rumbling deep in his chest. Ethan felt the old instinct flare, trust the dog. Margaret's story shifted under gentle questioning, details blurring where they should have been clear. Detective Reynolds took note, his polite demeanor cooling into something sharper. By midday, Child Protective Services had been contacted, and the baby, temporarily referred to as Baby Hope by the nurses, was moved to a quiet room in the neonatal ward. Ethan stood at the window watching her sleep, her tiny chest rising and falling with stubborn rhythm. He hadn't realized he was holding his breath until Rex nudged his knee with a wet nose, grounding him. In that small gesture, Ethan felt something unfamiliar stir. Not peace, not yet, but purpose. Not the kind assigned by orders or mission briefings, but something raw and personal, dangerous in its tenderness. When Reynolds returned with updates, his voice was lower, more serious. "There's more to this," he said, "and until we sort it out, she'll need protection." Ethan didn't answer right away. He looked at the sleeping child, at Rex reflected faintly in the glass beside him, and for the first time since the fire, allowed himself to acknowledge a truth he couldn't ignore. The flames had spared her for a reason he didn't yet understand, and whatever came next, walking away was no longer an option. The days after the fire did not return to normal. They settled into a strange, careful quiet, like a house after guests have left, but their voices still linger in the walls. Ethan Walker found himself moving between the hospital and his small rented townhouse on the east side of Portland, a modest place with bare walls and furniture chosen for function rather than comfort. The silence there had once been deliberate, a shield against memories, but now it felt unfinished. Rex noticed it too, pacing more than usual, nails clicking softly on the hardwood floor, amber eyes tracking Ethan with patient concern. On the third morning, Child Protective Services assigned a caseworker to the baby. Her name was Sarah Whitman. She arrived at St. Vincent Hospital carrying a worn leather satchel and the faint smell of peppermint tea. Sarah was in her early 40s, tall and slender, with ash blonde hair cut just below her chin, and streaked naturally with gray she did not bother to hide. Her skin was fair, weathered slightly around the eyes, in a way that suggested years spent listening to hard stories. She wore simple clothes, flat shoes, a wool coat, no jewelry beyond a thin wedding band that looked more symbolic than current. Her voice was calm, steady, practiced not in authority but reassurance. People like Sarah learned early that panic was contagious, and she had made it her job never to pass it on. Sarah observed Ethan carefully as they spoke. She noticed how he stood slightly angled toward the bassinet, never fully turning his back on the baby, how his hands remained loosely clenched as if ready to act. She also noticed Rex, who sat close to Ethan's leg, posture alert but non-threatening, eyes flicking from Sarah back to the infant. "We don't usually allow animals on the ward," Sarah said gently, "but I'm told he hasn't left her side." Ethan gave a brief nod. "He won't," he replied. It wasn't a challenge. It was a fact. The baby, still officially unnamed but increasingly called Hope by the nurses, had gained strength. Her skin had lost its alarming redness, settling into a pale, healthy pink. When she cried now, it was louder, indignant, full of demand rather than fear. Ethan watched her tiny fists flex and relax, watched her eyes open longer each day. Something about her persistence unsettled him. It reminded him too much of promises he once thought unbreakable. Sarah explained the situation plainly. The investigation into Lucas Bennett was expanding, and Margaret Collins had been flagged for inconsistencies serious enough to halt any immediate custody claim. "Until we know more," Sarah said, "Hope will be placed in temporary protective care. Foster placement is the usual route." Ethan's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He had expected this, trained himself to accept it, but the idea landed like a blow all the same. Rex rose slowly, sensing the shift, positioning himself closer to the bassinet. "What does that mean?" Ethan asked, his voice level, but something brittle underneath. Sarah met his gaze without flinching. "It means she'll go to a certified foster home within the next 48 hours. She paused, then added, "Unless there's another option." Ethan didn't speak. He didn't trust himself to. The word option echoed too loudly in his head. That afternoon, Sarah visited Ethan's townhouse as part of routine assessment. She noted the orderliness of the space, the absence of personal photographs, the military precision in how everything was placed. Rex followed her politely, sniffing once before settling near the doorway, watchful but calm. "You live alone," Sarah observed. "By choice," Ethan answered. She nodded. "Sometimes choice starts as survival," she said, not accusing, simply stating something she had learned the hard way. As they talked, fragments of Ethan's past surfaced, not as confession, but context. He spoke briefly of his years as a Navy SEAL, of discipline and loss, of a marriage that had ended quietly after the death of their son, grief turning them into strangers sharing the same roof. He did not dramatize it. He didn't have to. Sarah heard the weight in the spaces between his words. "Trauma doesn't disqualify you from caring," she said softly. "It teaches you the cost of it." Ethan looked away at that, toward the window, rain streaking the glass again, as if Portland had decided this story required it. That evening, Ethan returned to the hospital alone. Rex was required to stay behind this time, and the separation felt wrong immediately. He stood beside Hope's bassinet, watching her sleep, her mouth forming small, uncertain shapes as if practicing words meant for later. He found himself talking without realizing it, murmuring steady nonsense the way he once imagined fathers did. When she stirred and reached out blindly, her fingers brushed his knuckle. The contact was fleeting, accidental, and devastating. His breath caught. 8 years collapsed into a single, fragile moment. The decision came quietly, without ceremony. When Sarah returned the next morning, Ethan was waiting. He looked more tired, but there was a clarity in his eyes she hadn't seen before. "I want to be considered," he said, "as temporary guardian, foster placement, whatever it takes." Sarah studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "It won't be easy," she warned. "There will be evaluations, background checks, home inspections." Ethan didn't hesitate. "I've lived my life being evaluated," he replied. "This time, it matters." Sarah made notes. Detective Reynolds, looped back into the process, agreed to expedite what he could. By late afternoon, paperwork was moving, cautiously, deliberately. Hope slept through most of it, unaware that the shape of her future was shifting again. When Ethan finally carried her out of the hospital for the first time, Rex waiting at the curb, tail wagging once in quiet approval, the city felt different. Not safer, not kinder, but altered, as if something irreversible had begun. And Ethan knew, with a certainty that scared him more than any fire, that this chapter could no longer end with him walking away. Ethan Walker brought Hope home on a quiet Thursday afternoon, the sky low and colorless, as if Portland had decided not to interfere with what felt like a private moment. His townhouse, once a place of deliberate emptiness, seemed to hesitate as they crossed the threshold together. The rooms were clean, spare, almost echoing, the kind of space built to avoid attachment. Ethan moved carefully, as if noise itself might frighten the fragile new order. He set Hope's carrier down in the living room, then stood there a moment too long, unsure what the next step was when no one was giving orders. Rex entered last, tail low but wagging once, sniffing the carrier thoroughly before sitting beside it, posture protective, amber eyes never leaving the infant's face. The first hours were awkward and clumsy. Ethan had prepared, at least on paper. There were bottles, diapers, a borrowed bassinet delivered earlier that morning by Child Protective Services, its white frame too pristine for the scarred man assembling it, his hands, steady in combat, fumbled with unfamiliar snaps and straps. Hope cried with surprising force, a sharp, indignant sound that filled the room and ricocheted inside Ethan's chest. He froze for a second, panic flaring. A memory of hospital monitors and flat lines threatening to surface. Rex broke the moment by stepping closer and sitting directly in front of Ethan, eyes steady, grounding. "Easy," Ethan muttered, though he wasn't sure who he was talking to. He lifted Hope, holding her against his chest the way the nurse had shown him, careful and firm. Her cries softened, then slowed, her tiny body settling, as if recognizing something solid beneath the chaos. That evening there was a knock at the door. Ethan stiffened instantly, instinct flaring before reason. Rex rose with him, silent but alert. At the door stood an older woman with silver hair pulled into a loose braid over one shoulder, her posture slightly stooped but her eyes sharp. She introduced herself as Linda Moore, the next-door neighbor. Linda was in her late 60s, thin but strong-looking, with sun-spotted skin and hands that spoke of a lifetime of practical work. She wore a wool cardigan that smelled faintly of soap and lavender. "I saw the car seat," she said simply, nodding toward the living room. "Figured you might need something warm." She held out a casserole dish without ceremony. Linda didn't pry. She didn't smile too much. She was the kind of woman who offered help the way others offered weather updates, quietly, without expectation. Ethan thanked her, surprised by the tightness in his throat. Rex sniffed her once and, finding no threat, lay back down. Sleep did not come easily that night. Hope woke every few hours, her cries cutting through the townhouse like an alarm. Ethan moved through the dark on instinct alone, guided by dim lamps and the quiet presence of Rex at his heel. He fed her, changed her, held her when nothing else worked. With each repetition, the fear dulled slightly, replaced by a cautious rhythm. Between feedings, he sat on the couch, Hope asleep against his chest, her breath warm and steady. He stared into the darkness, thinking of all the things he could lose if he failed her, and all the things he had already lost that somehow still hadn't destroyed him. The next morning brought Sarah Whitman back, clipboard in hand, eyes observant but not unkind. She noted the baby supplies, the cleanliness, the way Hope responded when Ethan picked her up. She watched Rex carefully, assessing the dog's calm vigilance. "He's gentle," Sarah remarked. Ethan nodded. "He knows the difference," he said. Sarah's inspection was thorough but fair. She asked about support, about work, about what Ethan would do when exhaustion set in. He answered honestly. "I'll adjust," he said. "I always do." It wasn't bravado. It was a statement shaped by survival. Later that afternoon, Detective Reynolds called with an update. Lucas Bennett had confessed under pressure, the insurance fraud unraveling quickly. Margaret Collins was under further investigation, her connection to the child more complicated and more troubling than she had claimed. "You did the right thing," Reynolds said, voice heavy with a respect he didn't give lightly. Ethan ended the call and looked down at Hope, who was awake, studying his face with unfocused curiosity. "You hear that?" he murmured. "We're still standing." By evening, the townhouse felt different. Not full, not warm, but alive. Linda's casserole cooled on the counter. A soft nightlight glowed near the bassinet. Rex slept nearby, one ear always turned toward Hope. Ethan sat on the floor, back against the couch, watching the rise and fall of Hope's chest. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring. Hearings, evaluations, risks he couldn't control. But as Hope shifted and let out a small, contented sound, something inside him settled into place. This chapter didn't end with certainty. It ended with commitment, and for the first time in years, that was enough. Spring arrived quietly in Portland, not with warmth at first, but with longer mornings, pale sunlight slipping through the blinds of Ethan Walker's townhouse and settling on the floor like a promise that didn't rush. Hope was 3 months old now, her cries fewer, her smiles arriving in brief, uncertain flashes that still caught Ethan off guard every time. He had learned her rhythms the way he once learned tide charts and patrol schedules. Wake, feed, rock, wait, repeat. The routine didn't shrink him, it steadied him. Rex adapted too, 4-year-old muscles still powerful, but movements gentler now, lying near the bassinet with his head resting on crossed paws, ears twitching whenever Hope stirred. His sable coat had begun to shed with the season, leaving traces of himself everywhere, as if marking the house as claimed. The hearing was set for a Friday morning. Ethan dressed carefully, choosing a simple button-down shirt and clean jeans, his beard trimmed, his posture as straight as it had ever been. He did not wear his medals. He didn't need them. Sarah Whitman met him outside the courthouse, her ash-blonde hair tucked beneath a neutral scarf, clipboard replaced by a slim folder. She looked composed but tired, the way people do when they've carried responsibility for too long without complaint. "Whatever happens," she said quietly, "you've done right by her." Ethan nodded, hope bundled against his chest, her eyes wide, curious about the echoing hallway and unfamiliar voices. Inside, the judge assigned to the case was Robert Hale, a man in his early 60s with a lean build and a weathered face that suggested time spent outdoors rather than behind a bench. His hair was white and cropped short, his glasses thin-framed, his gaze direct but not unkind. Years earlier, a house fire had taken his sister and her family, a fact that had altered his approach to cases involving children without softening his respect for the law. He listened closely as Detective Reynolds testified to the investigation's conclusion, Lucas Bennett's confession, the confirmed fraud, the absence of any legitimate family claim. Margaret Collins had vanished from Portland altogether, her story collapsing under scrutiny. When Ethan was asked to speak, he kept his voice level. He spoke of nights without sleep, of learning to hold something fragile without fear, of choosing to stay when leaving would have been easier. He did not ask for sympathy. He asked for a chance. Judge Hale's decision was measured, deliberate. Temporary guardianship would be extended. The path toward adoption would remain open, pending final clearances. The words landed softly, but their weight was enormous. Ethan felt his breath release in a way it hadn't since the fire. Sarah allowed herself a small smile, professional, but genuine. Rex, waiting patiently outside, wagged his tail once when Ethan returned, sensing victory without needing to understand it. Life did not become perfect. After that, it became fuller. Linda Moore continued to appear on Thursdays with soup or advice Ethan hadn't asked for, but quietly appreciated. Emily Carter visited once, off shift, her auburn hair loose, bringing a small knitted blanket she admitted she didn't remember making. Detective Reynolds checked in occasionally, less as an officer now, and more as a witness to something he'd helped set in motion. Evenings stretched longer. Hope learned to laugh, a sudden, bubbling sound that startled Ethan every time and left him grinning like a man who didn't recognize himself. One afternoon, as cherry blossoms began to open along the street, Ethan took Hope and Rex to the small park near the river. The grass was damp, the air cool, the city moving around them in its ordinary way. Ethan sat on a bench, Hope cradled in his arms, Rex stretched at his feet. A breeze carried the scent of water and new leaves. Hope reached up, fingers grasping at nothing, then found Ethan's beard, tugging gently. He laughed, the sound unfamiliar but welcome. Rex lifted his head and huffed softly, tail thumping once in approval. Ethan thought of the fire then, not with dread but distance, of how everything he believed had ended had somehow begun again in smoke and chaos. He did not pretend the future would be easy. There would be questions, there would be scars, but as hope settled against him, warm and alive, he understood something he had missed for years. Survival was not the same as living. This was living. As the sun dipped lower, turning the river gold, Ethan stood and adjusted Hope against his shoulder. "We're going home," he said quietly, though he wasn't sure who he was reassuring. Rex rose beside him, steady and sure. Together they walked back toward the townhouse, toward a life no longer defined by what had been lost, but by what had been chosen. The fire was over. What remained was light. Sometimes miracles do not arrive as thunder or fire from the sky. Sometimes they come quietly, wrapped in smoke, carried through fear, placed gently into human hands at the exact moment a heart is ready to open. What happened on Maple Street was not just a rescue from flames, it was a reminder that God still works through ordinary people who choose courage over comfort, love over retreat. In our daily lives, we often believe we are too broken, too late, or too small to be part of something sacred. Yet God has a way of turning ashes into beginnings, of using loss to prepare us for purpose. A single act of compassion can become a doorway to healing, not only for the one who is saved, but for the one who dares to stay. If you are carrying grief, uncertainty, or fear today, remember this. God's timing is never rushed, and His plans are never wasted. Even in the darkest moments, light is already on its way. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment and tell us where you are watching from or what this story reminded you of. And subscribe to the channel to support more stories of faith, courage, and second chances. May God bless you and your family, guard your heart, and remind you, today and always, that miracles still happen and no soul is ever forgotten.